Hello, my name is Rabbi Moshe Steiner. Welcome to this 4-part series on Chabad.org. The objective of our course is to identify the biblical commandments and major rabbinical obligations connected to the holiday of Passover, Pesach. We will look at the major themes of the holiday and examine them under the microscopes of halacha and Hasidic philosophy. It is our hope that through this course and these examinations, you will come to the holiday from a more informed and inspired perspective. Now, any serious examination of Pesach should somehow focus on the Passover Haggadah. The Haggadah is a mix of rabbinic scholarship and also a practical how to observe the Seder. While this course is not a step-by-step guide or tutorial of how to observe Pesach and the Seder, we will use the Haggadah as a launch pad for the discussions that we will be having about the major themes of the holiday. And in this way, we hope to demonstrate how the big themes of Pesach come to life in the structure and text of the Pesach Haggadah. If the handouts and the notes and your notes from this course end up becoming your own personal Haggadah that you take with you to the Seder, then that's a wonderful fringe benefit as well. Finally, if you are going to be attending a Seder, and certainly if you are going to be leading a Seder, I recognize that the Seder, your Seder, will not be the proper forum for repeating the entire course or giving a lecture, but it is nice to be armed with some sound bites or insightful nuggets that you can share with the other participants of the Seder, and in this way not just elevate your own Pesach experience, but that of those that participate in the Pesach Seder with you as well. So the focus of today's lesson is Chametz. I remember a couple years back, I was in the big grocery store here in Toronto, and it's got a couple of kosher aisles in it. It was a couple of days before Pesach, and I walked into the store and asked one of the people stocking the shelves if they had or where the Q-tips were. So the woman, who was not Jewish, asked me if I'm looking for kosher for Passover Q-tips, and I just started laughing really hard because I thought to myself, people do lots of things with Q-tips, but I'm not going to put them in my mouth. I'm certainly not going to eat them. So I got a nice chuckle out of that. But when I was thinking about it afterwards, who knows? Maybe it's not a simple question as what meets the eye when you just look at it superficially. So what we need to do today is get an understanding of what exactly the Torah is telling us about the prohibitions for Chametz, the nature of Chametz, what is Chametz, and what does the Torah tell us about how Chametz can or cannot be used, consumed, etc. Let's start with the halachic definition of Chametz. Grain that goes through the fermentation process. By halacha's definition, that's what we call chametz. So what do I mean when I say halachic definition? I remember it was once in shul, we were reading the Torah's lists of kosher birds or the Torah's lists of non-kosher birds. And on that list, there's a bat. And some people get really worked up about this. Doesn't the Torah know that a bat is a mammal? A bat's not a bird. And we had this conversation where we said that, you know what, the Torah, in addition to the Torah being able to tell you what's kosher, what's not kosher, the Torah can also organize categories or species of things, define things in the way that it wants to. The halachic definition of birds and the scientific definition of birds may be slightly different. That's okay. The Torah gets to decide what it means when it talks about the category of birds, and then the Torah can say the halachot, the laws that apply to this halachic category. So in our discussion of chametz, it's important to understand we're talking about fermentation, we're talking about something that went through this process, but it's a process as defined by halacha. So let's have a look at what the Talmud has to say about chametz and this fermentation process. According to the Talmud, chametz starts with what Jewish law designates as the 5 types of grain. We're talking about wheat, spelt, barley, oats, and rye. Now, fermentation in the chemical sense can of course happen with other grains. It can even happen with foods that are not grain at all. But the Talmud, in its discussion about chametz, says that if you have a different grain, say corn or rice, and you mix it up with water and some type of chemical reaction happens, halacha has a different word for that. It calls it sirchoin, which loosely translates as something that produced an odor of sorts. It's not the halachic definition of chametz. The bottom line is, if you have any type of food product where the only grain is corn, rice, or anything else that's not one of the 5 types of grain that we identified, it will never be halachically deemed as chametz. Okay, so now you have flour from one of these 5 types of grain. This flour is now a candidate for chimutz, or the halachic process of becoming chametz. What is that process? The flour needs to be mixed with water and then left to sit. If immediately after mixing it, you bake it, so the baking, that intense heat for the baking, that kills or does not allow the process of chimutz to happen. But the Talmud says more than that. Baking it is not the only way of stopping this dough from going through, from becoming chametz. If you constantly handle it, says the Gemara, you can be handling it, so if you're moving it around energetically for the entire day, still the chimutz process will not happen. When it sits in one place, says the Gemara, for a period that it takes an individual, the average person, to walk a mil, now it becomes chametz. How long? What is that timing? Most authorities say that's a period of 18 minutes. The Rambam Maimonides says it's 24 minutes. Now, under certain conditions, chimutz can happen in even less than the 18 minutes. It's interesting that baking, right, when there's that extreme heat, that stops the fermentation process. But if you are working with the dough, and says the Talmud, that warms it up, that gives it a little bit of heat, and under the conditions of a little bit of heat, chimutz actually happens faster. Therefore, says halacha, if you're handling the dough energetically, and then you stop and just let it sit, it becomes chametz immediately. So if you're baking matzah, and you're handling the dough, immediately from handling the dough, it's got to go very quickly straight into the oven, because if it sits for even much less than 18 minutes, it can become chametz as well. Finally, another catalyst for the chimutz process, or the same type of idea, a lower level of heat. So if the dough is sitting not in the oven, but next to the oven, and it's a warmer environment, that could also cause the chimutz process to happen faster. Halacha gives a number of signs or symptoms where you can see if the halachic process of chimutz happened. If you start to see cracks in the dough or a changing of color, that would be a sign that it has become chametz. Finally, one final note on the halachic definition of chametz. In order for chametz to be chametz, it has to be fit for consumption. Even if it's not your ideal type of meal, if it's edible enough that a dog would eat it, then it has then it meets the halachic criteria for chametz. If it's something that is so repulsive, it's so old or so disgusting or so dirty that even a dog would reject it, then that, even if it's the candidate, it's one of the grains, it went through the fermentation process. If a dog rejects it, it's so dirty or disgusting, that's not chametz either. Okay, once we've got a clear definition of what chametz is, we can now tackle the Torah's prohibitions against chametz. Now, the ban on chametz is very, very unique and different from almost all other prohibitions in the Torah. It's interesting, when the Torah talks about non-kosher meat, and by that I mean meat that was slaughtered in a non-kosher way, the Torah says, don't eat it. La kelev tashlichun oisai. You should throw it to the dogs. The Midrash says something very interesting. It says that this is a special reward, talking about Pesach and the Exodus from Mitzrayim. We're told that when the Jewish people left Egypt, the dogs were nice to the Jewish people, and the dogs did not bark roughly or make the Exodus experience any less pleasurable or for the people, because they were quiet and nice. Says the Midrash, in reward to the dogs for their nice behavior at the time of the Exodus, if you slaughter meat and it ends up not being not a kosher shechita, it's not kosher, it's not fit for a Jewish person to eat, reward the dog for being at their best behavior at the time of the Exodus. Now, in addition to this being interesting, that you're showing appreciation to the dog, there's the halachic implications of this small phrase in the Torah are major. The Torah is saying something very important about the prohibition to eat this meat that was not slaughtered in a kosher way. The Torah is saying it's prohibited for you to ingest it, but you can derive benefit from it in other ways. If you have a pet, you can serve it to your pet. You can sell this meat. The only thing that the Torah says you can't do is consume it orally. Chametz is different. The prohibition against eating chametz is not just oral consumption. You're also not allowed to serve it to your pet. You can't use it as a cream. When halacha says don't have chametz, it's not just saying don't consume it orally. It's saying don't derive any benefit from it at all. In halachic terminology, the isur, the prohibition, is not just achila, for eating, for consumption. It's for hana, any form of benefit. Therefore, selling chametz on Pesach would, of course, be forbidden as well. So that's distinction number one. On to number two. When you talk about other prohibitions in the Torah, take, for example, milk and meat. You've got a huge pot of meat. A little bit of milk falls in. Does the whole pot become not kosher? Not necessarily. Jewish law has the concept of bittul. Bittul means that if the forbidden food or the forbidden mixture is so small, so minute, that you can't taste it, or in certain instances, what's required is that you have 60 times the amount of kosher food to overwhelm the non-kosher food, then you're okay. The isser of chametz is different in that sense. Biblically speaking, as long as the ratio is more than 1:6. So even if you have a small amount of chametz, which is overwhelmed in a pot with 5 times the amount of kosher for Pesach food, that is biblically prohibited according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides. Furthermore, from a rabbinical perspective, the ratio is, there is no end to the ratio. You can have a giant pot of kosher for Pesach food. 1 drop of chametz falls into it on Pesach, even if the ratio is 1 to 100, 1 to 1,000, 1 to 1,000,000. In the terminology of halacha, chametz is aser b'mashahu. Even the smallest minute amount of chametz makes an entire mixture of infinite amount become not kosher for Pesach. Thirdly, take milk and meat, for example. You can't eat it, but it's okay to own it. Chametz is also unique, that on Pesach, the Torah prohibits us from even owning the chametz. You can live, if you live in Canada and you've got a condo in Florida with a box of crackers in it over Pesach, that's problematic. You're not going to see that chametz. You're not going to get close to that chametz. You're not going to get anywhere near to eating that chametz. Just the very fact that you own it is problematic from the Torah's perspective when you're talking about chametz on Pesach. By the way, are there parallels for that? Are there other things that the Torah prohibits us from owning? It's certainly okay to own non-kosher meat. You can own a mixture of milk, milk that was cooked with meat is fine. You can own it. You can't eat it, but you can own it. Are there other things that the Torah prohibits us from owning? I can think of a couple. One thing that comes to mind when the Torah tells us, the Torah talks about how being honest in business, and you're not allowed to have, back in the day they would have weights to measure food. So if you sold a pound of sugar, so they would have a weight to measure that sugar. The Torah says not only are you not allowed to use a faulty weight, where your customer will end up getting less than the pound, you're not even allowed to own it. So that's one parallel that I can think of. But what makes a fourth and final thing, or what the fourth thing that we'll discuss today, that makes the prohibition of chametz very unique, is that there's actually a positive mitzvah to destroy the chametz that you own prior to the holiday, prior to Pesach. According to some opinions, and this is interesting, what happens if the day before Pesach you don't own any chametz? There are halachic authorities that maintain that you have an obligation to get a hold of some chametz, acquire some chametz, so that you can then destroy it and fulfill the biblical positive mitzvah of destroying chametz prior to Pesach. It's not a unanimous halachic ruling, but the Torah's attitude to rejecting chametz and destroying chametz goes that far that there's a special positive mitzvah to destroy the chametz. Now, we're going to refer to the Pesach Haggadah because the first important thing that happens in the Haggadah starts even before the holiday begins. On the day prior to Pesach, the Seder b'dikas chametz, the search and disposal of chametz. And this whole ceremony that the Haggadah instructs us to do is our way of fulfilling this positive mitzvah of destroying chametz and disowning it. So text 1 in your source sheets are the Haggadah's instructions to search for chametz on the night prior to the Pesach Seder. And then there's a special bracha that we make because we're fulfilling the biblical mitzvah of destroying chametz. You then search for the chametz, and then there's a special passage or legal statement that the Haggadah instructs us to make. And in this statement, what we do is we disown all of our chametz. And again, that's to fulfill or to make sure that we do not transgress the biblical prohibition to not own chametz. So the chametz that we identify, that we find, the Haggadah shows us how to burn it before noon prior to the Seder night. And the chametz that we're perhaps not aware of or not able to burn, the Haggadah instructs us to disown it and make it unimportant to us, nullified, ownerless, like the dust of the earth. And in this way, we fulfill the Torah's instructions to destroy chametz and avoid owning chametz on Pesach as well. Now that we have a better understanding of the Torah's prohibitions when it comes to chametz on Pesach, let's revisit our Q-tip question. Well, just because something doesn't go in your mouth on Pesach does not mean that it's not a Pesach problem. If something has chametz in it, and I don't think Q-tips do, but if something does have chametz in it, then it's not just consumption that's a problem. Even applying it as a cream to your skin can be problematic. Even owning it in the cabinet of your kitchen or bathroom could be problematic. Assuming that it's something that a dog would eat, just owning it could be a problem. So chametz on Pesach is more treif than pork. You can't eat a smidget of it. You can't feed it to your pet. You can't even own it. Why? Why is the Torah so obsessed with prohibiting, distancing chametz to the nth degree on Pesach? And by contrast, on Pesach it's more treif than pork, but after Pesach it's fine. It's kosher. If you've ever been overwhelmed before, or ever in the need of help, and someone shows up, and they're ready to lend you a hand, two types of people. Sometimes there's the person that appears and says, "How can I help you?" And that's wonderful when someone lends you a hand that way. But every once in a while you encounter somebody who says, "How can I help you?" And then you're like, "Oh, you can't help me at all." Like the story of the boy and the girl that were on a date, and the guy was just talking and talking and talking and talking. And after talking for a very long time, he said, "Okay, enough about me. Now let me hear, what do you think of me?" We all know people like that, people who are so trapped in their own selves, in their own ego. That's what chametz represents. The flat matzah cracker gets the job done. You eat it, there's no chametz there, it'll sustain you, you're full, but it's got no frills. It's not puffy, there's nothing, frankly, appealing or tasty about it. It's just there to get the job done. In Hasidic philosophy, that's the non-chametz bread. The non-chametz bread represents the person who doesn't really have a sense of self. He just shows up, gets the job done, and is out of there. Chametz bread is bloated. The fermentation process breaks down parts of this dough, turns it into gas, and you get bubbles in the mixture. So it's like a puff pastry that shows up, like in the bakery. It's really tasty, it's really big, and it says, "Look, I'm here." An inflated sense of self. Now, ego is certainly not the only character flaw that plagues the human condition. We've got a whole hosts of problems that can plague us. We're prone to you have people that are constantly angry or argumentative. You have addictive personalities. You have people who are chronically lazy, unmotivated, sad, anxious, depressed. But the scholars of Musar, who probe the depths of the human condition, the good, the bad, and the evil, they say that while ego is certainly not the only problem in the human condition, it is the mother of all problems. Because if you reflect and you think about it, you look at the angry guy, you look at the anxious person, you look at the depressed person, when you boil it down, it often comes down to the same thing. This person is trapped in themselves. They can't get out of themselves. If they would, they'd be happy. They'd be motivated. They wouldn't be so angry. Think for a moment, picture in your mind, maybe this happens at your own office, I hope not, a company boardroom filled with people, and there's a meeting. You're trying to work through a problem, but everybody's got their baggage, and this guy's got this personality, and this guy's got his ego, and this guy's got his pride, and this guy's got his impatience. People have so many problems, so much baggage that they become blinded. They're not capable of identifying the problem and figuring out a strategy to solve it. This ego baggage problem gets not just in the way of companies functioning properly. Ego is at work when it comes to the way that family dynamics go, and people within their own personal lives. We all have stuff, we all have issues to deal with. More often than not, the problems are extremely, these are things that we can solve. These are things that we can deal with. But sometimes we're so caught up in self, we can't identify the problems properly. We can't see things clearly. We can't identify the problem, and we are not in the position to solve them just because we're trapped in self, in the Chametz ego. Pesach is the great ego detox. Pharaoh, the big villain of the Pesach story, is described in the prophets as the man that said, Li Ya'ori, the Nile belongs to me, Va'ani asisini, and I created myself. He was a god in his own mind. Talk about ego. Pesach is about escaping from the ego of Paro and the ego of Chametz, detoxing from that. For 8 days, it's really not about you. And we go to the nth degree. We distance the ego to such a degree that it's like you don't want to have anything to do with it. Don't eat it, don't touch it, don't even own it. So Pesach is this fantastic opportunity to break free of your own self-image, your own self-trajectory, and accomplish, just get beyond yourself. But self-image is not necessarily a bad thing. There is a kosher type of self-image. As a matter of fact, self-image or pride is sometimes a mitzvah. So Chametz ego is not so different than Chametz, whiskey Chametz, for example. If you enjoy whiskey Chametz in moderation, it's actually a wonderful thing. You just have to be really careful with it because it's easy, or it can happen, that people fall into abusing whiskey Chametz. Ego Chametz is kind of like the same thing. Picture a scenario, or in my own life, one of my kids is clowning around, and now I, the father, understand that it's time for me to assert my authority. So far it's kosher. But the gap, crossing the line between asserting my authority as a parent and going from there into anger can happen so easily. That's why ego chametz has to be handled very, very responsibly. So if somebody approaches me in the shul and we're having a kiddush, and I know that person has a problem, struggles with alcohol addiction, and says, let's just do a little l'chaim. I have to say no, and it's not an easy thing to do. In my heart, I'm saying to myself, I hope one day, soon, you will be in a place that that the two of us will be able to enjoy a little bit of l'chaim together in a responsible way. But right now, you're in detox mode. You have to reject the whiskey chametz completely. Says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, during the 8 days of Pesach, we are all in detox mode. We reject chametz to the nth degree. We reject the ego to the nth degree. For the 8 days of Pesach, there is no sense of self. And then this empowers us for the rest of the year to be able to administer and use a kosher sense of self in a healthy way. Okay, so here's your soundbite for your Pesach Seder. Every one of us have two parts. We're comprised of two aspects. There is the chametz ego you, and then there's the soul you. The chametz ego you is heavy. It's bloated. It can't get things done. It can't solve problems. Your soul has infinite power. During the 8 days of Pesach, we have the opportunity to allow the infinite power of the soul you to break free of the shackles of the ego you. Now, if you're so bold, here's an exercise that you may want to challenge yourself and the participants of the Seder to articulate in one word or in 2 words one aspect of self-consciousness or self-image, something about me, about the way I think about myself that's holding me back. You may want to plant a couple of people around the table, advise them of what's going to happen. You might get some very interesting conversation, liberating conversation going. Good luck.